get started. So it's a great honor and pleasure to see all of you here today. And we're really delighted to have Professor Lant Pritchett with us, who is now a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, but has a very illustrious and deep career at the World Bank, at the Kennedy School of Government, where for many years he led the International Development MPA/ID program at the Kennedy School. He's a highly cited economist doing research, on development issues and now on labor economics. And we've invited him here today to talk about the future of development assistance. Is there a future of the development assistance? And he's had a lot to say about this over the years. And I thought of no better voice to help us think through some of these issues than someone who's been a very constructive critic. So Professor Pritchett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I want to talk about the future of development assistance, but to talk about the future of development assistance, you have to talk about what development is in a way that you can imagine it being assisted. So let's, oftentimes these discussions start from the assistance and only generally work back towards development. I want to do it the opposite. And the title is National Development. Let's get the prince back into Hamlet. My kind of core thesis is that there is something called national development, and that if you achieve this thing called national development, national development is a machinery for nominating and solving problems. So to some extent, if you're going to solve problems, you need national development. And if you get national development, you solve problems. And attempting to solve the problems themselves without solving the underlying manifestation of the lack of national development is mostly a losing game. So I want to sort of say first what national development is, and I'm going to use the phrase getting to Denmark, which is why I chose the prince and Hamlet. Getting to Denmark is just national development is a fourfold transformation of countries. So they acquire a highly productive economy, they acquire a capable state, they acquire an historical evolution transformational process, a polity that is responsive to the needs of the citizens. I'm not using more common words like democracy because they're more specific, but at the same time more ambiguous. But you want a government that is responsive to the needs of citizens, and then some equal treatment of fellow citizens, social cohesion as a fourth social transformation. So essentially national development is in some ways a descriptive process of this fourfold transformation. Second, this fourfold transformation itself brings about every good thing. If you get the machinery of a productive economy, a capable state, a responsive polity, and social cohesion, you basically achieve all of the goals that one might have for human well-being. And it is kind of a necessary and sufficient condition. If you don't do it, you won't do it. If you do it, it will happen. Third, mitigating the worst consequences of the lack of development is not an alternative development strategy. So if you say we have high levels of malnutrition are bad, we're going to focus on reducing malnutrition without national development, that may well make some progress on the limited targets of malnutrition, but adding that up is not a strategy for development. It's not development to just mitigate the consequences. You actually, entirely different process. And lastly, therefore, a strategy for national development, which would have to precede a notion of development assistance, because development assistance can only be conceived of as assistance to a strategy for national development, has to rely on that you have a correct and causal model of what leads to progress on these four elements. If you say what's development assistance about? It's about creating a highly productive economy. It's about creating a capable state. It's about creating a responsive polity. It's about creating social cohesion. And if it's not a correct causal model of doing one of those four things, it's not a development strategy. And if your assistance isn't going to a way that demonstrably connects to those four things, it's not a development assistance strategy. It can be a humanitarian assistance strategy, but it's not a development assistance strategy. So that's what I'm going to say. So first of all, national development is empirically necessary and empirically sufficient for every good thing. And I'm going to show you kind of, you know, these are the four things that what national development is. And this is importantly, and I always am hesitant to use the word ontological because it sounds fancier than it is, but it's ontologically about countries. Meaning, if you ask what development is a dynamic process of something becoming a more fully realized version of what it ontologically is. So a tadpole, an egg, becoming a tadpole, becoming a frog, is the development process of frogness. But the frogness is the ontological characteristic. An egg doesn't become an egg, doesn't become an oak tree. And an acorn becoming an oak tree is the development of becoming a more fully realized oak tree. And what the national development is, the fundamental unit is this unit called a country. That's a little bit amorphous, but kind of we know what it is. And hence it's about aggregations and ways in which people cooperate. So if you think about all of the aspects of development, productive economy, state capability, polity, cohesion, it's fundamentally about ways in which aggregates of people cooperate. Mechanisms, rules, norms, institutions, all of these are descriptors of things that can ontologically only be had by a country, or ontologically can only be had by an aggregate, and some of them, the aggregate that has them is a country. Or it could be a sub-region, but it's an aggregate, which is important because the world isn't full of poor people. The world is full of people who lack adequate mechanisms to cooperate productively. And if you're trapped in those aggregate mechanisms, you can be the most fantastic person in the world, in your personal capabilities, in your grit, in your everything else, and you're still going to be poor because you're not embedded in successful mechanisms of cooperation. So to some extent, you can think of national development as how do groups of people or how do aggregates of people successfully cooperate in producing public sector organizations that are functional, successfully cooperate in producing political systems that are responsive to the needs of citizens, successfully cooperate in producing high product value through value chains. Okay, now, this next little thing I'm going to show you has kind of a funny story because I was on an airplane flying, I think, from Colombia, and I was sitting next to somebody, and I usually don't talk to people, but happened to like strike up a conversation. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, oh, I work on a development think tank. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What does your development think tank do? It's like, oh, well, we've developed a mechanism, a measure of social progress because we think too much development attention has been placed on economic growth and not enough on direct measures of well-being. I think exactly the opposite is true. So I didn't say what I did. I moved the conversation to something else, but I learned about the social progress index through this conversation. And I thought, I'm going to go see how much this social progress index is correlated with economic growth. Because he thinks we're putting too much attention on growth, and he's constructed, or been part of a group, constructed this thing to prove that. And I think once he constructs it, he's going to learn he's wrong. So this is the social progress index. It has 3 pillars, basic needs, and each of these pillars has 4 components, and each of these 4 components has elements. And basic human needs, foundations of well-being, opportunity, And this is kind of a list of every good thing you could want. And it's a reasonable list. I like have no objection with this as a list of things that, you know, freedom over life choices, freedom of religion, private property rights, freedom of movement, suicide, mobile phones. Like, this is a grab bag of everything. You know, there's not that much debate about, oh, no, that thing that you think is a good thing is a bad thing. Well, these are all good things, right? And then they aggregate this into one of each of these and then add it up. And they add it up in reasonable ways and they build it in reasonable ways. So this is a good candidate for what I want to show. And then what I do is I just take a simple regression and I ask how much of the variation in social progress across countries in the world is associated with GDP per capita, a measure of state capability, and a measure of democracy. So I'm going to take three factors and say how much of the variation. And the answer is, in statistical terms, about all of it. Meaning the correlation of the National Development Index, which is adding up by the regression weights GDP, state capability, and the correlation of that in the social progress index is 0.95. I've done a study of different measures of child mortality, and the correlation between the World Bank's measure of child mortality and the UN's measure of child mortality is 0.95. So trying to get measures of the same thing to have a correlation of 0.95 is hard. And they've just built a progress index on the premise that national development was overestimated and proved that they were wrong. Because if you get national development, and then I invented this graphic form, and what these lines are, this is an envelopment curve. Because, statistically, you think about standard errors, but let's not think about standard errors. This is actually the experience of every country in the world. And the main thing about this graph is the white space. Right? If these two things were uncorrelated, there would be very little white space. There would be somebody everywhere. We'd have some people with low national development and high social progress. We'd have some people with high national development and low social progress. But we don't have that. No country in the world has the experience of having high social progress and low national development. It's not that it's statistically unlikely, it hasn't historically happened. No one has gotten to Argentina's level of national development without getting to at least 60 on this 0 to 100 scale of national development. So no one is in any of that space. Yeah.
So often when I see, so much of the work on communities, social progress, social cohesion, it's often in environments where there is weak state capabilities, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea is that, of course, you want social progress, not economic progress, but that you can't work with the existing, formal institutions that are that generate the kind of long-term economic growth. Well,
right.
We won't say that the state is necessarily the engine of all economics. So this is a way to engage with countries to deal with it. So it's a substitute for those other things. And one of the questions, and I'm sure we can talk about later, is, there's a great opportunity cost of engaging in that kind of work.
But this is, again, now there is variation within this. And if I were a citizen of Niger, which is NER here, I'm doing really badly even for my low national development. And there are probably ways to mitigate the worst consequences of being at Niger's level. And Tajikistan this is TGK, right? Decades of experience, I know all these acronyms. This is progress, right? So you can, through local cooperation in an Ostrom-esque or other kind of analytical fashion, mitigate the consequences of living in a crappy country. So at the country level, we can't cooperate, but we can more effectively cooperate at the local level. And that local operation can mitigate those consequences. But then there are two things. One is, are the ways in which you're doing the local cooperation capable of reaggregating to national progress? Or does reinforcing the local cooperation stymie national progress? So could we be, you go, wow, this country, has all these ethnic groups that can't cooperate, so let's just restructure the delivery of core public services around levels at which they can cooperate, which might be ethnicities. But that could lead to civil war. So I think a lot of what the question about bottom-up development is not whether it's bottom, but whether it's up. Is there an up from what you're doing to doing it in a way that leads to broader and more effective and more capable cooperation? So I was in a discussion when I was living and working in India with the World Bank. I was having a discussion with our water sector people who wanted to do a rural water project, and they wanted to create these water user communities as part of their water project. And at the same time, the Indian Constitution, actually from India? Yeah. Okay. The Indian Constitution had the Panchayat Raj authorities, which had 3 levels. And one of the potential responsibilities of the Panchayat Raj institutions, which were democratically elected, was water. And I said, well, why don't we use the Panchayat Raj authority water community to build the rural water? And they were like, oh, they're corrupt. And so we can't put it through them because they're corrupt. And I said, well, yeah, but how are we going to fix their corruption? How are we going to build their capability unless we give them some autonomy and responsibility and then build accountability around a governmentality function as opposed to creating a freestanding thing? And we debated this for like an hour. And finally, I said, okay, we're disagreeing about the modality of this project, but let's step back and say, what's your vision of the water sector in India? And they were like, well, our vision of the water sector in India is that every household live within a kilometer of an improved water source that can deliver 40 liters of safe water a day. And I was like, well, no wonder we can't agree. My vision of the water sector is everybody in India can take a hot shower inside their house. And unless what you're doing is on the path to my vision of development, if your vision of development is just, I can walk to a public standpipe, and that's not on the path to having a hot shower. If that's on the path to having a hot shower, that's bottom up. But if it stops there, that's bottom, and then where's the up? If I have developed a mechanism whose ultimate objective is public standpipes accessible to everyone, but not piped water, like, am I doing development, right? So anyway, that was something of a discourse, but I think this is exactly the discourse we need to be having, because did we have, ultimately, people that, ultimately developed countries, everybody in the country has piped water into their house. And that piped water is always supplied by a municipal and or private corporation that is a large, sophisticated corporation. Entity. No, it doesn't have to be private, but private and public both do it. But it's never, I have never gone to a meeting before I turned on my shower. I have never gone to a community user group. It becomes background to our life, right? We don't have to expend social capital because we have administrative capital. We have administrative functionality. So, how much are you, so like I say, you have to have a vision of, we're building water user associations at the local level that are going to evolve in this direction, or or something, or they just disappear. So there's a big difference, and I've gone on a long time, but this is the core theme of my talk. There's a difference between mitigation, let's make sure everybody has a public standpipe, and development, which is everybody takes a hot shower. And if your vision is development is only about getting to the public standpipe, then there is no future of development assistance. This development's that modality of mitigation ends
long before countries are actually successful. So the gap between everybody have access to a public standpipe and Denmark is a long ways. And we're getting a lot of countries where everybody has a standpipe, and still not a lot of countries where everybody has an effective water system that everybody has access to. Okay, long discourse, but nobody is here and nobody is there. So if you're not doing this, you're not doing that. And again, you might be doing, getting from Burundi to Haiti, but you're not getting from Burundi to Argentina without national development. So to go north in social progress, you have to go east in national development, full stop. It's like, this isn't a statistical standard error thing. This graph is all countries in the world, and no one's ever done that. So if you're planning on doing that, you have to explain why you're going to do that when no one's ever done it yet. And if you worry about doing this, you also want to think, oh, but we could do development and not get that. No, that's not how it works. You're not going to do that. Okay. I can show you a bunch of other slides, but I'll skip them. I'll skip them. You can look at the paper or look at them later. But this, the relative importance, and by the way, this is national development, not just growth, but growth is the most important thing for basic human needs. This is how much moving across the spectrum of growth matters to basic human needs versus improving state capability versus democracy. So at low levels of development, growth is and low measures of development, growth is everything. As you get to more sophisticated notions of what the development, and as development proceeds, growth becomes less important and state capability becomes more important. Which makes sense because problems that people could solve with their own income, they solve when they have income. Problems that require increasing levels of sophistication usually require capable state. Okay, so I'm not yet a growth fundamentalist, and this just breaks down individual things. So, not surprisingly, if you ask, how does national development affect access to shelter? Well, moving in growth explains all of the increase in the improvement of shelter from national development. But if you ask about crime, where's crime? Personal safety, this is crime. Growth doesn't improve crime, but state capability helps a lot. So again, if you think of public goods, private goods, the standard way we analyze sets of problems, things that are private goods get solved by income. Things that are more and more public goods have to get solved by a different kind of cooperation, usually through state mechanisms. So again, this is a uniform fourfold transformational theory. Now, some things that we have nominated as problems and spent a lot of time on, like poverty, this is the association between all of the actual observations on headcount poverty from the standard World Bank source. And this is the median of the distribution of income or consumption in the country from which you measured poverty. And the point of this is that the R squared, the association of these two things is perfect. So if you are going to solve headcount poverty, you need to increase the median person's income. And again, full stop. Everything that is said about poverty projects is irrelevant to progress on poverty. The countries that solve poverty, Vietnam solved poverty in our lifetime. China solved poverty in our lifetime. Indonesia solved poverty. Many of them had zero poverty projects. It just wasn't on their agenda until, and countries adopt poverty projects kind of after poverty has fallen to very low levels. So if you decompose how much of, Vietnam is an interesting country because we actually have household surveys during the entire trajectory because they started progress on this trajectory quite late.
and you ask how much of the reduction in poverty and headcount poverty at low poverty lines in Vietnam, where it went from like well over 50% to like 1%. So they eliminated low bar poverty. How much of it is predicted by their growth and how much is left over to be explained by anything else Vietnam did? 100% is growth. You don't have to ask, why did poverty go down? You take this nonlinear trajectory, you move Vietnam along it in the way that you would have predicted, and that's how much the poverty went down. So again, everything about poverty projects is irrelevant to the discussion of poverty. Second, this is a same kind of envelopment graph, and this is basics. So I've constructed an index of basics in a way that it turns out doesn't really matter because every reasonable index of basics looks exactly the same. They're all super highly correlated. So this is an index of basics, and this isn't national development. This is just GDP per capita. And you get the same thing. Like nobody's up here, nobody's over here. Equatorial Guinea is the only country that's out here as an outlier. And it's obvious, yeah, if you pump a bunch of oil and 6 families steal it all. So, you know, you can have GDP growth, but it's super rare, right? It's super rare to get out here into higher GDP. And like no one but Equatorial Guinea gets out to developed country levels of even the oil countries that get out here through oil, they still end up having very high provision basics. So again, growth delivers a lot of progress on everything we worry about in terms of people's access. And it's very hard. Again, there is variation here and you can push here and you can push here quite a bit really. But ultimately, even everyone's favorite example of Cuba, yeah, they have pushed up here, but they are not at the levels that the developed countries have attained. So, okay. So which means development projects that aren't embedded in a strategy of national development are mostly beside the point. They're just not really that important to development progress. And even if they're highly cost effective, so you can imagine, you know, and this is the rabbit hole into which development economics has disappeared. This is a study that was published in Nature magazine. It's arguably the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. And in Niger, a country with zero, essentially, national development, they had a project of giving people money, and then that was the control group, it was a cash transfer, and they experimented with a psychosocial intervention of a nudgy kind of type, and they showed that compared to the control group, you know, the psychosocial intervention raised incomes and was super cost effective because it was really cheap. Really cheap as an incremental addition with once you had all of the infrastructure of delivering a cash grant, delivering a brochure that said, hey, buck up, things will be better tomorrow, turned out to be cheap. And it had a statistically demonstrable effect. And so this is like what the table they would show you to show that the treatment versus the control worked. But this is what this looks like on a real development graph. This is what Vietnam did. They went from Vietnam in 1992 having the same per capita income as Niger to $8.85 per person per day consumption. So they didn't go from $1.70 to $1.17. They went from $1.70 to $8. That's development. And that's what eliminated poverty in Vietnam. So this stuff is just, you know, I can demonstrate that if you were a philanthropist and if you had the desire to spend $10 million, this would be a rigorously demonstrated cost-effective way to spend your $10 million. But it's not development. It's mitigation.
And again, if you want to do cost-effective mitigation, do cost-effective mitigation, but don't get in my damn way. Don't get in the way of doing development because you're doing cost-effective mitigation. Which, okay. So just to return to the Prince and Hamlet theme, there is a play that is Hamlet without the prince. It's called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, written by Tom Stoppard. And the play is two minor characters in the big play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, just wander around on the stage. Kind of often it's performed with smoke and stuff. They have no idea what's going on in the larger play. And they wander around, and then in the end they get hung. Because in the play they die, right? So that's development without, if development isn't focused on national development, it's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They're wandering around, they're irrelevant to the action in the play, and ultimately they die, because nobody cares. So, am I giving tough messages here? I think no one misunderstands me. And so I think to some extent, this is a paper that I wrote in 2015. This is a text from or a graph from a paper I wrote in 2015, in which I sort of said, here's how development assistance is going to die. Which is, and you don't have to focus on, we could expand this, and I would have, or you wrote it probably. This isn't just about growth as a development priority, but kind of think of this as, to what extent is your priority national development? Again, of the fourfold type, we can think of just growth, but we can also think of the fourfold type. And then here is the coalition in rich countries that were supportive pre-1990 of development assistance. You had the non-altruistic Cold Warriors. Their main concern was that the developing countries not become Soviet allies. And so they thought a national development progress that delivered on human well-being and was successfully moving would be an antidote to shifting. You know, they used to call it the first world, the second world, the third world. The second world was the Soviet. They didn't want the third world going to the second world, right? And they were far and away the most powerful forces behind development assistance. Then there were the more materialist altruists, who's me, who wants human beings to have a better lifestyle, but doesn't have a particular view about what they should have a better lifestyle about, right? I mean, if I'm going through the countryside and I see a guy sitting on the road at the end of the day having a smoke, I'm all for it. That's national development. He can afford a cigarette. I don't have any views about what their consumption should be. I am just a general materialist altruist. I'm glad that he's able to enjoy a good smoke at the end of the day. Then you have the post-materialist altruists, who are altruists, but often around specific agendas. I think every human being should have access to school. I think every human being should have access to, you know, a pipe water, right? Their needs are often kind of post-materialist. You know, I think every human being should be treated equally, and the equal treatment per se is more important than whether everybody gets treated well or everybody gets treated badly, right? And these were a relatively unimportant part of the coalition. And developing countries have always been, the leadership of developing countries has always been national development focused. No national president really, or no leadership, and I mean leadership generally, not just political. The vision of development was that the countries that were newly freed from colonialism would become full and equal partners in the world with the former colonialists. And that meant getting all the way to Denmark. No developing country leader, or very few, has ever articulated a vision of what their country would be that stopped short of Denmark. And why should they, right? Like Indonesia on independence was like, okay, we're free from the Dutch. We want to get to everything they have, we want, right? Everything good they have, right? So anyway, so this was the coalition. And the developing countries also had very little effective resistance to conditions in aid created by this group because they needed the money. So if you said, you know, here are the conditions under which we get the money, they're like, well, okay, we'll take it, right? And then what happened is that post 1990, these people got much less powerful in the coalition, and that all got replaced by this agenda. And this agenda doesn't at all correspond with what developing countries want. And when developing countries became more successful, they basically lost interest in what the development community was doing. Sure, you can come, you can like do some stuff on the side, but the power, you know, the governments weren't really that interested. And India, for instance, threw out all the bilaterals except for two. And that was clearly politics, not effectiveness. It was, yeah, they just threw out, you know, the Swedish bilateral. We don't want you anymore. You know, everybody but the Americans and British, they just threw out. Because they were, you know, so, and the way I describe this is, in general, this fracturing of the national development focused political coalition in the rich world led to an increase in the PA to VA ratio of development assistance. And the PA to VA ratio is pain in the ass to value add. And just generically, from the point of view of the recipient governments and people more broadly, I mean, the governments weren't often wildly at odds with the general public. It was just the conditions being imposed to get assistance, or the subjects that the assistance was addressing were just less and less important to them. And the transactional pain in the ass of dealing with them got higher. Then they just like, nah, we're not interested. Or we're not interested in doing it in the way that you insist we do it. And so, you know, African countries stopped taking development assistance for infrastructure. Because they knew they needed the infrastructure, but the development assistance community wasn't willing to give them infrastructure on terms and conditions that they were willing to take. And so having a very high-ranking Chinese official come to my office at Harvard and say, I just, you know, I've just been put in charge of like China's development strategy. Can you just explain one thing for me? Okay. Why the hell aren't you building roads in Africa? Like, why is this off the development agenda? Seems like they need roads, and it seems like you can build roads. Like, what went on? and there was a story. It was like, okay, you know, you could build roads, but the conditions that was being imposed under which you could acquire property, under which you could build a road, and just weren't worth it. And so the coalition just disappeared. Okay, and this is, you know, and the end game of this is that these people have a lot of power among the people who care about development, but don't have any power globally. So I just thought of the phrase this morning, the development community was increasingly pandering to the powerless. You had groups that were powerful within the development assistance community, but completely powerless politically. And the more development assistance pandered to the powerless, the less total support there was for development assistance. And eventually it just disappears into it just disappears. It's, yeah.
You know, I'm not sure.
Sorry, just before you say this, and by the way, one of the things about all of the cuts in development assistance is you don't actually see the developing countries complaining about it that much. Like,
They were tired of it.
You know, they could speak up and they go, it would be really super important to us if country X would continue with its really effective and helpful development assistance program.
Well, I would even argue with the fact that many of that there was a constituency, because my sense, after many years doing field work, is that there was real exhaustion from these kind of parallel structure efforts.
Yeah.
So, and people thought, like, how many decades of doing this in sub-Saharan Africa? Enough, like, this
Yeah.
isn't really doing anything. It makes you feel good, but it doesn't really do much for us. And you're asking a lot of us in terms of meetings and,
Right?
sitting
No, no.
around and assessments. But, but it also seems that the scale issue is really what's important here.
Yeah.
right? So that it feels really good to work in communities and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
engage, but as the scale of collective action, you can't solve it at the intercommunal level. That becomes harder, where you need to provide public goods at a larger scale. That's where the demand is, but that's where the social capital is the strongest. But everybody wants to intervene in that place where
Right.
collective action is very strong, and then they can walk right in and capitalize on that social capital. But building at that larger scale is much more difficult.
No, and let me tell you a tale of two cities. So when I lived and worked in Indonesia with the World Bank, and at the time, a friend of mine, Scott Guggenheim, who is one of the geniuses of development, was doing a project in Indonesia of local community grants, in which the local community was given, broader menu. So rather than getting a water project, you got a block grant, and the local community could choose how to use that block grant, right? But there were two key features of this. One, the grant level went to, it was a 5-tiered federalism. So there was a block and there was villages. So the grant went to the block, and the villages had to put forward proposals, and the money couldn't be subdivided among the villages equally. You had to choose which village got the grant based on the village's proposal. So it deliberately created a mechanism of deliberation. You forced them to choose among villages. So villages had incentive to prepare projects to propose to the block. And at the block meeting, the villages had to cooperate in deciding. They couldn't just divide the money equally among all the villages, which would be the natural non-cooperative or the natural non-deliberative instinct. They had to make choices. And second, this was part of a governmental structure. This wasn't an NGO. And the NGO implementation, the implementation apparatus was exclusively focused on process. They wouldn't tell you what to do, but they would insist on a deliberative process in the creation of the grant and in the decision. And they also insisted on a process of openness. You had to announce, here are the 3 villages, here's how much money they're getting, here's what they're going to do. And, in a way that everybody knew what the project was doing. Okay. That project, that project both ended and expanded, in the sense that eventually at the local level, the people, when donors would come, they would say, no, we want it in the way we get it from them. We want open menu, we want deliberative process, we want governmental control, we don't want a parallel organization, we don't want an NGO. And eventually the government changed the process regulations of the disbursement of more and more governmental projects to reflect these processes of transparency and accountability and deliberative structure. So it was actually it was intended from the beginning to reconstruct what had been deteriorated during the Suharto era of local governance, but it was local governance. It wasn't local, it wasn't social capital disarticulated from governmentality, right? Okay, now that type of project became very popular in the World Bank, and they took this project to Kenya. They took this project to Kenya, exact same structure, block grants, open but limited menu of what villages could do. Some of it involved direct transfers of livestock, some of it involved, Okay, and this project in the World Bank was rated as an excellent project for its first 3 years of implementation.
And then an American anthropologist who'd worked in Kenya a long time was out doing field work and kept hearing about this project, but not seeing it anywhere. And she started doing research, and it turns out it was fraud from start to finish. So they had all these minutes of the village meetings at which decisions were made with lists of people who had attended. It was all fraud. Like they had manufactured minutes. So all of the process compliance requirements were there on paper. And so the World Bank supervision would like, oh, here are the minutes, here's who attended, this is the decision they made. It was like fraud top to bottom. What?
This is Jean.
Yes, yes. And it turns out there's a paper about this that has been scrubbed from the internet because she was threatened with her life for having revealed it. She couldn't go back to Kenya because even though she had lots of friends in Kenya, she obviously made lots of enemies in Kenya. And she was told, don't come back because we can't guarantee your safety. Because after all, you just revealed a very profitable channel. So, so this is just saying, I'm not against projects, but a project has to be embedded in at least a strategy of how does this build towards, and I'm not, insisting that every country literally looks like Denmark in how it works, but you want to have the functionality of Denmark. You could have a variety of structures deliver the same functionality. And unless you have a plan for how your development project is moving from being implemented by NGOs to being integrated into the way the country actually works, it's not a development plan. Yeah.
I think you kind of got this, but just to ask a little bit more. So it seems like you're saying that the post-materialist place more conditions than a materialist altruist. You're not arguing for the real politic. But for the material altruist, what would be the difference about the conditions that they might apply than the post-materialist?
Well, for one thing, the post-materialists often want things targeted. So, is this project targeted just to women entrepreneurs? Right? It's like, okay, why are we worried about women entrepreneurs and not male entrepreneurs? The government have regulatory structures that inhibit entrepreneurship. I should be worried about entrepreneurship, male and female, and maybe I want women to be included, but the sort of targeting, or is it, just targeted to the poor? I had a discussion with a prominent Indian with Monte Carlo Walia, as a matter of fact, with Monte Carlo Walia, and we were talking about an agriculture project where we're trying to push farmers up the value chain to grow more vegetables and less like wheat crop and stuff, move up the value chain. And he was saying, you guys are, you World Bank guys are nuts, because it's going to be the more prosperous farmers that are going to move up the value chain first. So if you want to develop a value chain that can supply carrots to Walmart, it's going to be rich, powerful farmers that do it. And you guys want to create a project to benefit only the poorest of the poor. And it's like, the poorest of the poor are not going to lead the creation of the economic and material infrastructure to deliver quality carrots to Walmart. And they'll also benefit, you're going to move the whole distribution up. So a lot of it's targeting, a lot of it is, what is it about? I worked for a period for a philanthropic organization, and they all wanted win-win-win. They wanted a climate-friendly, women-led private sector thing. And I was like, win would be good. Like, win is really hard in these countries. Let's get win. No, we have to have win-win-win, right? So again, a variety, and then, so topics, beneficiaries, implementation structure, overall, we want NGO implementation. We want sharp targeting to specific groups of disadvantaged and marginalized. And we want, often, even within that, we want women entrepreneurs doing pro-green transition things.
Yeah.
And it's like, geez, it's like.
But baseline transparency, anti-corruption, that's
That's
materialist
governmentality,
Okay,
like how the government spends its money and openness about that and contestation about that. So, you know, in a weird way, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career on community kinds of things, but I'm trying to build the basis of a functional government, not some parallel structure. You know, I was working with this project in India, which, anyway, what connected you are, so I shouldn't name it, but anyway, it's this project in India. If I describe the project, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was in Andhra Pradesh, and they were creating these women's self-help groups. And, you know, as I looked at the project, I was asked to evaluate the project. And there was a lot of World Bank money going in relative to the economic benefits being created. And they said, oh, yeah, but all of this is building institutions. I'm like, that's great. What's the name of the institution you're building? I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, well, you know, church, university, labor union. We have names for types of institutions. What's the name of the type of institution you're building? And they were like, oh, but this is a new type of institution. I said, well, I have to admit, I'm pretty skeptical because human beings have been around for thousands of years, and most institutions that are needed have been built, and there's various levels of functionality, but they have names. And if I look at what you're doing, I have a name for what you're building. You're building a mass-based political party. That's what you're building. And like, if you want to say that's what you're building, that's fine with me, but that's what you're building, right? But they didn't want to say that's what they were building. So again, sometimes you're building, I want institutions that are bottom up. You know, I'm an Ostrom-esque kind of person. Local cooperation is the foundation. I don't believe in, top down. I believe in bottom up, but it's got to go up. You got to have a vision of what does up look like of the mechanism. So let's just, let's quit. Let's stop there because we have to stop at 1. Okay, I'll stop there. The rest of this is just, you need a model of, now, that said, I am not selling you an orthodox model of growth. Like, a lot of the backlash was, there was this neoliberal doctrine of how to achieve growth that was really not a correct causal model of growth. But if you're rejecting the causal model of growth, you don't reject growth as an objective, you reject the mechanisms and you look for new mechanisms. So there's a lot of literature of looking, how do we have more effective, practical, contextual, relevant advice about growth? As opposed to the randomistas who say, since we gave bad advice about growth, let's stop giving advice about growth. It's like, okay, kind of. Not okay. It's stupid. It's just criminally stupid. It's like, it's saying we're not going, we're going to do randomized controlled trials of poverty projects that for sure have almost no impact on the time evolution of poverty because we can't give effective advice about growth. Well, why not do more research about giving effective advice about growth, right? I mean, you don't have to say there's only one model. And same thing with state capability. We need the Bavarian transplantation model, seemingly attractive, but it just didn't work. But you don't therefore give up on creating an effective government. You say, what's a way of creating an effective government that's practical and contextually relevant through which, and development projects are certainly can potentially be a big component of that. But if they're orthogonal, if they're unrelated to that, they're not really helpful. So, and again, this is a big challenge, and just if you go look at what I did I was part of an 8-year project on, improving quality of education in terms of learning outcomes at the basic level. And, it was a sectoral problem. You had to fix the sector. So again, in the education sector, a lot of people were worried about inclusion, but there was nothing to be included into. The basic education system was just dysfunctional. And so we kind of wrote a paper showing that the elite were like way below the SDG minimum learning level. So, you know, there was nothing to be included into. It wasn't that girls were being excluded from these really functional schools, or that, you know, it wasn't that the rural schools were crappy, but the urban schools were terrific. It was that all the schools were terrible and getting worse. And the donors were focused on, you know, inclusion of the marginalized. And it's like, that's great if, you know, you have something terrific to be included into. I'm all for it, but let's have something to be included into. Okay. And then, yeah, there's other stuff, but listen, change your life, but I'm gonna stop.
Good question. I'll keep going.
I mean, so you said at the very beginning, like, national development is like a machine.
Yeah.
And for me, I think that strikes as true, and something that, I mean, I've been thinking about, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is like, does development economists in general come out of the social sciences? This idea that like there are universal regularities in the world that we can uncover, but that sits kind of differently from an engineering discipline that says like, there are universal regularities about the world, but we create an artificial thing to insert into systems. But the artificiality of what we create is a reduction in complexity from the world. But we're putting something kind of modular and simple into the world to change this much more complex thing that has kind of open-ended and unbounded. We can't know for sure what will happen. And how I see the random, like people who are RCT prone, is saying like, what we're trying to find is like universal regularities about these types of, and this just goes from your other talk about kind of construct building classification of interventions, is like, we say like this class of interventions has this inherent universal rule when we don't have a good science or a good ontological lens on like, what does it mean in the social sciences to do engineering? And the same way physical sciences have a whole body of engineering about, which is really just the problem of how to deal with intervening in complex systems. And the social sciences have just taken social science and plopped it into development. And I think for me, there's like a gap of what does the science of an artificial and the social world look like? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it fits into this idea of development as a machine.
Yeah, but sort of what I mean by development as a machinery, right? Is if you look at, you know, our organizational strategy for building capability, it's called problem-driven iterative adaptation. And what that starts from is a problem, right? And so the first step of this is that in order to, you know, deliver effective action, something has to be nominated as a problem, and you have to generate a minimal level of actionable commitment to solving the problem. And so the engineering approach, which is, you know, what most of, I mean, the thing about the randomistas is they are the counter-revolution.
Yeah.
Right? They actually came in to save mainstream development, not change it. Because mainstream development always had this engineering approach that we can solve problems that weren't locally nominated as problems with encapsulated interventions.
Yeah.
And, you know, the immediate pre-randomista character of the development discussion was a significant fraction of us rejecting the engineering model of development project interventions as an accurate description of how societies evolved to solve problems, to a more Ostrom-esque, Hirschmanian, you know, complex social process approach. And we were, in my view, team local, team bottom up, with real up, was winning. And then along come the randomistas and go, screw all of that. We can do effective, the problem with development interventions is not that they've fundamentally misconceived the entire way in which development really happens, but they haven't applied this right technical thing to assure their effectiveness through rigorous impact evaluation. Completely, totally counter-revolutionary. The mainstream of development organizations loved this because it didn't involve any substantive real change in how they went about doing their business. And developing countries hated it because they were like, no, like these are deep social, historical, political problems that require context-specific understanding of the mechanisms and dynamics to fix. And you know, you've just brought back quick fix with an RCT on top of it. So you know, the randomistas is kind of a bad name because randomistas is like Sandinistas or other istas, like the revolutionary, but they were the counter-revolution. They were the forces of the status quo, which is why they were so successful. Is the status quo? Oh shit, yeah. Let's plug an RCT on top of our project. And by the way, let's plug an RCT ex ante on top of our project, knowing it'll never get implemented because nobody really cares about this shit. But we'll design it with one and then stop doing it in the middle and no one will care because so again, the randomistas were the saviors of the status quo. And at the same time, it's demise because basically the randomistas let the mainstream status quo continue in this direction of isolated, articulated, non-governmental, targeted, non-development strategy stuff.
Yeah.
Again, it's the opposite of how it's understood. These guys are revolutionary. It's like, no, they were like forces of the status quo.
And that's where, like, I think you see just real exhaustion. I've seen, you know, I was
Yeah.
just in a country in Central Asia, and I was dealing with a senior government official who said, we're talking about the demise of USAID, and he said, like, you know, we really wanted development. We want to join the WTO, help us.
Right.
But you've given us all this stuff, you're exporting your culture wars, your, you know, whoever's president and all this micro level, it doesn't yield us anything. And are you really here trying to undermine the government anyway? Because that's from a political perspective, it seems, yet in the US, you know, this breathlessness about the end of development, people are gonna die. And,
And people, the tension is mitigation of the worst consequences for human beings of national development is a noble endeavor. Like it's terrific, right? And people may well die because the end of humanitarian assistance. But humanitarian assistance wasn't development. It wasn't an integral part of a coherent strategy of building any of the components, right? I am kind of a growth fundamentalist, but not at the same time, meaning growth is really, really good because you've enhanced productivity of people, but so is state capability and so is responsibility and so is social cohesion. But humanitarian assistance wasn't actually a long-term development strategy of any of those four things. It was mitigating the consequences of the lack of it, often in ways that could be immediately effective, but again, had no up to the bottom, right? So again, I think, but again, when you say development assistance has died, it's like, it was kind of dying as development assistance anyway. Like how much development was being produced by the assistance versus humanitarian support. And again, humanitarian support's great, but you wanted both feet. You wanted humanitarian when it was needed, but India no longer needed humanitarian assistance. Like India, I've lived and worked in India, been going there since 1991 to today. it's a rapidly developing country, but it's a long ways from being Denmark, a long ways. And the idea that if development assistance stops where India is, it's not development assistance, it's mitigation, so. Other questions?
I think that, so, like initially present the sort of a picture of like holistic picture of economic development, like with economic, political, and I wonder there's all like very complex concepts and then phenomena like both political order and state capacity and also economic growth, which can be like the different sectors can be growing and everything. And I wonder how like practically to balance all this because in principle there are examples of countries which growth along all these components and had improvements along all these components in recent history. I know. I think, for instance, I know this post-Soviet, post-communist countries within European Union. I think what may be the clearest example, it had improvements both like on democratic score, like economics and everything. But in reality, it's very hard to achieve. It's such a complex system.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works. How to make it all work and to make it like balanced and it's very
Yes, that's my point. But the thing is that if it's hard, but super important, you don't give up on it because it's hard, right? And so what, the risk is, people want to say, this overall development part is so complicated, we can't really understand it. Let's reduce it to some engineering thing we know for sure we can do and plug that in. But if you move from the hard and important to the doable but demonstrably unimportant, that's not necessarily win. So, my last slides are, we need a better social science of how this overall process works in order to be effective, and we should expect it to be hard, context specific. We should expect there not to be universal regularities. Like I have a paper called Rely on Rigorous Evidence is Bad Advice. There aren't universal regularities to what they're doing because there's no external validity, there's no construct validity. The randomistas are like the alchemists. Yeah. Like the alchemists did lots of experiments, but they didn't have a correct theory of chemistry, so they never. So anyway, so yes, it's hard. Let's stop pretending it's not hard, but let's work with people in the countries who want this to happen in ways that are open and flexible and rigorous about bringing the best possible thinking and action to bear on it. And that's just a really hard thing to sustain politically. Because, if you talk to philanthropists and I go, look, you can do this cost-effective thing, but it's not really gonna make any difference in the long run, or you can devote, half of the money you would just give away in cash transfers to really hard thinking and supporting people, working at the graph, working on how do we really get bottom up strategies working. They're like, nah, it's like, that seems long-term, it seems fuzzy, it seems like we might not succeed, we might do harm. Well, let's just give people cash. It's like, it's hard to sustain a political strategy. And the EU accession is, by the way, a great example because EU accession is a binding recommitment to getting to Denmark. but you can only jump so far. So EU accession succeeded if you were Poland and destroyed everybody. The attempt to get to Denmark in one jump led a lot of countries for whom that jump was too far to fall into an abyss. So again, you needed a strategy that was okay. Niger is not going to get to EU accession in the next 20 years, right? 30 years, right? So you need a strategy for Niger, Haiti, Mali, Nepal, probably these days. You need a strategy for India, functional in many, many ways, strong performance in many, many ways, but you want that to continue. You need a strategy for Brazil. And it can't all be EU accession. But on the other hand, that's what we do, is we do isomorphic mimicry of just pretend, just adopt the law that Denmark has. Okay.
Thank you very much.